Last contribution tonight is from Meredith Blais, who is Manager of Water Industry Policy with Water Corporation Western Australia.
Thank you.
Oh, and your contribution tonight, freshwater thinking water solutions for thirsty water.
I'm just trying to.
Sorry, I'll just get the presentation up. I hope you've got a sense of humour for my last slide after Jorg's presentation today. It's a picture of the Swan River, which I was regretting halfway through that presentation. Thanks very much, everyone. It was really interesting presentations today from Jorg and from Olga as well. And I was talking to Olga before, and there's a lot of interest in regional Western Australia around seizing the opportunity of water for agriculture. And a lot of people are talking about the potential for desalinated water, particularly in greenhouse settings. And I think that there'll be a lot of interest in that work more generally. So I very much enjoyed it. So thank you very much. So I thought I'd talk a little bit. It is easy when you're talking about water in Western Australia to look on the dark side, and I very much appreciate how challenging it has been. But really my story tonight is really a story of adaptation, about what we're actually doing to try to cope with the changing water situation in Western Australia. And I've really used Perth as a case study. I do have a few at the back of the room if anyone's interested. It's just a bit of an overview of water services in Western Australia, so actually having a look in each of the regions if you're at all interested. Very different solutions we have in different parts of the state. I guess one of the things, just to put this in context, so these little Pac-Man diagrams are worthwhile just looking at. So on the far left-hand side, you've got all of the licensed water supply in Western Australia. You can see that the Water Corporation uses about 8% of that for public water supply. We also are a bulk water provider to the irrigation co-ops, the Ord, Harvey, Carnarvon and Preston Valley. But if you just look at the public water supply of the total licensed use, we use about 8% of that water. And then if we take that and we look at where we use that, so in Perth we use about 68% of that water, which supports somewhere between 75 and 80% of the population, and country regions use 32%. I think it's not fair to say that our country cousins are necessarily less water-wise than we are, but there has been a history in West Australia of using scheme water more for non-residential use than there has been in Perth, and that's an imbalance that we're trying to correct at the moment. But it gives you a sense of the 8% that we use of public water supply, about 2/3 of that is actually used in Perth. And then if you have a look at where the Perth water supply is used, about 70% of that is used in residential areas, followed by 18% in non-residential. So that includes business, but a lot of the service sector, schools, hospitals, government agencies, etc. Use about that much, and non-revenue, which is one of the areas that we're really targeting at the moment, which is really our losses, they're about 12% of total water supply in Perth. So that gives you some context of how the Perth water use fits into the overall licensed water supply in West Australia. Of course, we all know the story of declining rainfall. It does change a little from year to year, but 2013 was a particularly dry year, so you can see there that in many areas of West Australia the rainfalls were the lowest on record, and as well we had very high temperatures in some of the state, particularly in some of the southwest. And that has had an impact on stream flows. This graph goes from 1912 to the current time, and I was talking to Phil Commander earlier, and we probably should stretch that graph back to 1870, because you might actually see that perhaps the period where the Water Corporation and our antecedents sort of came from when they started planning, it perhaps was a particularly wet period, so that variability might have kicked in somewhat there, but nonetheless that is the experience that I guess Perth was built on and planned around from a water supply perspective. And what we've seen over that sort of 100-year period is a 12% reduction in rainfall has actually resulted in a 50% reduction in stream flows. So it's had this amplified impact in terms of stream flows into the public water supply dams, which were, of course, built upon, along the Darling Scarp when Perth was settled. And you can see the numbers there from 1911 to 1970s. We averaged something like 338 gigalitres. Since 2001, the average has been 79 gigalitres, and I think this year it's under 60 gigalitres for this past winter. And of course, we've had winters where we've had 10 gigalitres and 13 gigalitres of inflow into our dams. So when you think that Perth uses about 300 gigalitres of water, you have to start wondering, where is that deficit going to come from? How are we actually going to supply the city? So the impact has been significant. So when we started to look at that, in about 2010, we set up a project called Water Forever, and we originally went to plan for perhaps a 10 or 20-year period of time to provide some security. So we were hearing from our customers that they didn't feel confident at all in the water supply. So we went and talked to them and said, okay, what if we do a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan? And they came back resoundingly and said, no, we need a 200-year plan, a 100-year plan, at which point I just thought we need another project manager because I have no idea how to do that. So we settled on a 50-year plan, and that really was a turning point for us, because what it forces you to do is you can't possibly extrapolate your past experience for 50 years. You really have to step back, look at that, and then backcast from that perspective. And really, that was a gift from our customers. There was a lot of wisdom that came from our customers all the way through the project. One thing that I remember really vividly is we did a lot of work on a sustainability assessment. So we ranked 46 different kinds of water supply and demand options on a set of criteria, sustainability criteria that we developed with Dr. Jenny Pope from Murdoch University. And we ranked them all. Then we asked our customers, what do you think? What are your preferred options? And they almost exactly mirrored the rigorous assessment that we've done through the sustainability on the triple bottom line outcome. So it goes to show that there is a lot of innate wisdom in the community that we need to continue to tap into. So the challenge that we set ourselves was saying, well, how do we actually provide water for the next 50 years for Perth when we're expecting an even drier climate? So at the time, we chose a moderate climate scenario, and the science wasn't quite as advanced as even it was now. It was a 2007 work done by Climate Change Australia, and that was for a 20% further reduction in rainfall over the next 50 years. And at the time, we talked about twice as many people. So that was at the higher end of population forecasts at the time. It is interesting how much that has been outstripped. In the last 5 years, we've added 300,000 people to Perth. So we started 5 years ago, we had about 1.6 million. Now we're about 1.95 million in Perth. So that is a lot of people in that short space of time. So it's quite possible that we may even outstrip that twice as many people, but the pace of that growth has taken us by surprise. And of course, with less environmental impact. At the time, I think the year that we started the project, we abstracted something like 160 gigalitres from Nangara Mound, with a heavier emphasis on the superficial aquifer than currently, and we knew that had to change. So there were a number of challenges ahead of us. One of the things that I've mentioned is we did do a lot of community engagement all the way through the project. And I think it's easy to trivialise that, but we found it was very important, both in terms of, aligning our thinking, opening up our thinking to new ways. But one of the things that we have invested quite heavily in is the Waterwise Schools program. It's been operating for over 20 years now. And we're actually just releasing some research that we've done with Curtin University with the School of Psychology there. And what we're finding is that the more educated people are about water, the more open they are to a wider range of water resources and water options. So there is real value beyond the superficial, of actually engaging and starting as early as possible with engaging the community, because it does open them up to new opportunities, and they do become very water conscious as they're going through. And that's going to be vital. You'll see that. So the response that we identified ultimately was that we needed to take an adaptive planning approach and we needed to develop a portfolio of options. So the idea of the adaptive planning was really acknowledging that we don't know all the things that are going to happen. So it wasn't so much a question of picking the sources and sort of lining them up and saying, well, that's the first source and the second source and so forth. It was more, how do we actually expand this portfolio of options? So we came up with three main platforms. One was around developing new sources, one around increasing water recycling, and the third one around reducing water use. And we set targets for those. So we wanted to develop somewhere between 70 to 100 gigalitres of new sources. We wanted to increase water recycling to about 30% of what Perth uses by 2030 and 60% by 2060, and reduce water use a quarter by 2060. And we also saw that working with the community was going to be central to that because it's really a social change. And one of the things that we needed to do was to do that in an environmentally responsible way. So the idea of the portfolio is not static, it's not set in time. So every year we update the portfolio. So some options fall off the table for whatever reason and other options come on board. And so, for example, we've had some groundwater options. Some have fallen off, some have actually come on board. Groundwater replenishment was in the portfolio, but we've now increased the potential that can produce. So every year we update that so that we're aware of all the source options and demand options that we have to meet Perth's needs. So in terms of developing new sources, desalination, I guess, has been one of the big transformations for Perth. As was mentioned, the Perth Seawater Desalination Plant was the first one in Australia, and we did get a bargain price, and I often think that was because people just wanted to demonstrate the technology and they saw that there was a huge potential. I don't know, Olga, if you think that might have had an impact, but that Kwinana plant has been a really robust plant. It is a base load source for us, so it operates all the time, subject to environmental approvals. It's 45 gigalitres from Kwinana. And we've now built and now doubled the size of the Binningup, or the Southern Seawater Desalination Plant in Binningup, not terribly far from Mile down south. When you drive down that way and you realise that's where the desalination plant is, though, you do realise how very far away from that is from Perth. And when you think that was the next site available, it really is pause. Then that tells you that we can't just rely on desalination solely. But nonetheless, we now have about 50% of Perth's water needs can be met from existing desalination capacity that we have. And I think that it has developed a level of expertise that we have here and a critical mass in terms of all the skilled trades and support that you need to operate those plants. They are base load plants, as I said, they don't turn off. We do have some operating models that if dam inflows hit certain levels, they can be scaled back, but we haven't hit those to date. And desalination, of course, relies on, particularly the southern plant, relies on the dams. So we transport the water into the dams. We still use them as balancing storage for the desalination. So the dams are not going to be decommissioned anytime soon. Actually, another thing, sorry, it's really hard to get a good groundwater slide, and I sort of looked around and I couldn't get one and then I forgot. But we also have developed some groundwater resources in the last few years. So we've developed 6 gigalitres in the confined aquifer for Chandicott, and we're currently working with the Department of Water on developing the Eglinton Northwest Coastal scheme for, I think, 5 to 6 gigalitres. So that's another low-cost and relatively proximate water resource that we're developing for Perth. Recycled water, as I mentioned, is a major opportunity that we think. This gives you a sense of recycled water across West Australia. Of what we use, you can see that most of the recycled water goes for commercial and industrial uses, and that would have increased considerably if the Pilbara had have kept going. So there are a number of opportunities up there. It has slowed down somewhat, but it's still a significant use. Public open space is a major area. A lot of work has been undertaken in terms of in our own wastewater treatment plants, so recycling water for processed water. That's the on-site reuse you can see there. We have I think we have 10 woodlots in West Australia that we use for tree farm disposal, and groundwater replenishment, 1.2 gigalitres. This is last year, so a relatively small contribution. So that's the current state. Overall, we recycle about 21 billion litres of recycled water a year. That represents about 13% of the state's wastewater, so there's huge potential to increase that. And one of the major uses is groundwater replenishment, so that's taking water from the Beanyard wastewater treatment plant currently and in treating that, injecting that into the confined aquifers and drawing that out at a later stage for public water supply. So in July this year, the Minister for Water approved a 14 gigalitre scheme to actually go into production. So that will become the next source for Perth that will supply the integrated water supply scheme, and that is expected to become operational in 2016. It does focus on the confined aquifers, and a lot of that was around the regulatory framework. So we work closely with the Department of Water, Department of Health, the Department of Environmental Regulation to develop the regulatory frameworks. I think one of the things that you get when you get these innovations, and Sundrop is another good example of that, is what they do is they sort of set the path for others. They sort of give permission for other cities or towns or communities to start looking, because you actually have developed the science and the expertise and the regulation behind that to support those options. In terms of the treatment, obviously it comes from the wastewater treatment plant, and that's water that's suitable for discharge to the ocean. Then it goes through several treatment plants, trains including ultrafiltration, RO and UV for final disinfection. That's actually to get it to the point that it is injected, and then obviously there's retention time in the aquifer before they're abstracted out. One of the things that makes the scheme quite economical, I guess, is that it is contained on the wastewater treatment plant site. So we already have the land, so you've already got the existing buffers. You don't need long conveyance pipelines. And really that is a factor that's underestimated in terms of all the solutions, in terms of the cost and the complexity of linking them into the scheme. And we also had some abstraction bores which we've turned off for environmental reasons that we've actually been able to reuse to draw that water back into the public water supply, and where it will be retreated again for potable use. So groundwater replenishment, to give you a sense, that first scheme is 14 gigalitres. The potential is to get potentially 100 gigalitres for Perth from groundwater replenishment. And of course that would be a combination of coming from Beanyard, Subiaco, Woodman Point wastewater treatment plants. So there's considerable potential for that as a water resource for Perth in the future. We also are continuing to work with industry, and as I said, I think the demand for recycled water is increasing all the time. We actually do have a fairly small industrial base in terms of water use. Very little scheme water is used by industry. It's almost all groundwater or recycled water, particularly from the Kwinana scheme. So really the opportunities for increasing recycling in many cases are actually substituting failing groundwater resources, and so it's a substitute for groundwater rather than scheme water, and certainly in other parts of the state a lot of interest. Also for parks and gardens, and I think the amenity that can be provided from recycled water is something that's often forgotten. We operate about 84 schemes across the state, and of those, 58 of those irrigate parks and ovals. So it is a considerable contribution to the amenity in regional West Australia in particular. When you drive around if you see a golf course and it's irrigated, you can almost bet that that's coming from recycled water, as is a number of school ovals and most of the public open space regionally. Reducing water use is a significant issue. I'll just point out a couple of things. You can see here that the top line is the population forecast. So you can see that there has been a significant spike in terms of the population forecast expected for Perth. And the green line is the amount of total water supplied. And the yellow line, or the light green line down the bottom, is actually what's happening to per capita consumption. There's a couple of things I want to point out here. One is that since we started working on reducing water use and really made a focus on water efficiency, it's taken the volatility of the system out altogether. So we used to have to plan for an extra 20 or 30 gigalitres of headroom in the scheme because of that volatility that you can see. So the community basically didn't respond to whether it was wet or dry, hot or whatever. It sort of kept going on. What we're actually seeing now is the community have established new patterns of working with water and consuming water. It's a sort of a slow, gradual change. When we worked on the sensitivity analysis for the strategy, we looked at three main factors. One was total population numbers, the other was climate, and the other one was per capita consumption in terms of what was going to be the big factor we had to watch for. What we found is that total population per se is relatively easy to plan for. Even though it comes in over time and you can adjust to it. Secondly, with climate, what we'd found is that because we'd already started to mitigate the impacts of climate, it had dropped down in terms of its importance to us in the planning. But the thing that really stood out is per capita consumption. If we don't manage per capita consumption, if we don't get the whole community on board, everything sort of falls apart, and you have to be looking at considerably more source augmentation than we're currently looking at. So we'll talk a lot about that, and it's one of the main parameters that we look at in planning, not just for per scheme, but water use in general. So a lot of that is around working with WaterWise programs. We also do those in partnership with the Department of Water, and the WaterWise Council program is a significant one that we're working on, as well as the specialist and approved programs with those interested, so particularly in the landscape, gardening, land development sectors. And we've also done a lot of work, community-based social marketing, so working one-on-one with households through Home Smart programs, which are a combination of sort of changing behaviours and also retrofitting appliances and fittings to make them more efficient. Rethinking public spaces, so, do we have to irrigate everything? What are the alternatives to that? This is a Rio Tinto Naturescape on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is a project, the Grove, Mossel Park, Cottesloe and Charlotte Peppermint Grove, the library precinct, which has done a lot of work in terms of on-site decentralised sources, both stormwater, grey water, black water reuse, as well as rainwater harvesting and design of the gardens. They've done a fantastic job there. So they're the sort of things that kind of what we call the off-grid solutions that are starting to make a big difference. And they also help the community. They break through the community some of the things, different approaches that they can think of at different scales. I mentioned the winter sprinkler ban, so that was brought in 2010. We save about 5.5 gigalitres of water a year from that. From the 2-day-a-week sprinkler ban, we're currently saving around 53 gigalitres of water. I think the biggest thing with those things is that while we do have compliance and enforcement programs, overwhelmingly when we survey our customers, they say that they want those programs to stay. So they don't consider them an imposition on their lifestyle. That's one of the things that we've been trying to work on is show that you can maintain the lifestyle, at least for a time, perhaps not when there's a further 20% reduction in rainfall, but at least for a time you can retain the lifestyle by using less water, by wasting less water, and all our customers report that it does have flow-on impacts how they look at things like energy and transport and other consumables. And community engagement, as I said, this is Josh's house that we were a part of last few years. So all these sorts of things do help to, acquaint the community with some of the options that are available now. Working with business has been an absolute delight, and I think it's really surprised us. So again, it was a regulatory change brought in 2007 that all businesses using more than 20 megalitres of water a year in West Australia had to have a managed water efficiency plan. They didn't necessarily have to set targets, but they had to have a plan. And what we've tried to turn that around is make it a very positive experience. So they get awards, they get certificates, and they are totally engaged. They see this as sort of good business. What they tell us is that the water savings don't necessarily pay off, but what they find is that by paying attention to water, they pay attention to energy, they pay attention to other aspects of their business. So it is technically mandated, but effectively it's a voluntary program, and the participation of the set of business has been significant. And we work very hard with high water using sectors, the leisure industry in particular, We've done a lot of work recently on cooling towers, a lot of work on construction water and alternatives to that. So we sort of target individual sectors to come up with solutions as well. So the upshot of all of that is that by 2030, we believe that we can save a further 200 gigalitres. So if you think about that, it's about 4 desalination plants just through the water efficiency programs that we're doing. And that will reduce use from what was 191 kilolitres per person to 115 kilolitres per person. We're currently at 131 kilolitres per person, so there's a way to go. But that's our roadmap, I guess, of where we actually think the savings will come from. So I guess the long and the short of it is that they come from a number of projects and a number of programs that we're implementing, and every year we revise the data, I guess, to have a look at it. One of the things that is surprising is that price has actually started to make an impact. There's long been a discussion about the price sensitivity or otherwise of water, and people felt that it was relatively inelastic, but we are seeing that there has been a price response, which has been good. And we rebalance the charges, so we reduce the fixed charge and increase the volumetric charge, so there's a bigger signal as people consume water. It'll be interesting to see if that continues into the future. But significant savings for Perth. So really, I guess, in a nutshell, Perth's water supply is a bit of a case study in adaptation. So the dotted line there are the stream flows on average. The blue line is the population growth, and what you can see is the early reliance on dams in 1958. These numbers are significant. I think I stole this slide from Sue Murphy, our CEO. I think that was the year she was born in or something. I think I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say that. 1980 is the year she started university. In 2004 year she joined Water Corporation or something. But it does sort of show what happened. So early reliance on dam with some groundwater, which started in the early 1940s. In 1980, groundwater, which we had expected to be our saviour, had started coming up quite significantly. And that continued to grow into 2004. But you can see 10 years on now, and it's in that year we only used 7% from dams, 42% from groundwater, 50% from desalination, and 1% from groundwater replenishment. And we would be expecting the role of groundwater replenishment to increase significantly over time, as I mentioned. So I don't think the story is over yet, but I guess that's the story to date. And what we've learned is that you need a number of demand and supply options, and we're looking at smaller and smaller solutions all the time and a portfolio of them as we sort of adapt to the changes. And the goal, so this is where the sense of humour kicks in, is we are hoping that Perth is livable, resilient and productive as much as possible from a public water supply perspective.